here talking about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. We'll go around quickly and say whether or not we recommend it, and then we're going to dive into spoilers. So, for me, I think that it was fun. You know, some of the comedy hit, some of the comedy didn't. Very emotional, and I like that. And great music. And overall, I think a decent time. So, I would say definitely recommend for me.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. Similar. I thought for the majority, most of the comedy landed. All of the emotional moments landed. All of the characters make sense. It's still, in my opinion, the best superhero team up of any franchise that's been released up to this point on either side. So yeah, highly recommend it.
Yeah, I had a really good time with it. I would also recommend it with a couple caveats. The first being, if you are someone who has a soul / are particularly sensitive to, you know, bad things happening to animals, you probably knew from the trailer that was going to be a part of this movie, but I think a lot of people probably don't know that it is the large majority of this movie. And it can be pretty brutal at times, so just go in knowing what you're getting yourself into, because it does get very dark. And then also, I don't think that it's appropriate for kids below a certain age. That was something that also kind of dawned on me while I was watching it. I was like, some of this is bordering on, like, you know, hard PG-13.
It could have been a rated R movie.
Yeah, I was like, this could have been rated R. And
it's crazy to me that this isn't, and Jennifer's Body was rated R.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think just if this is something where you were intending to bring your kids because they love the Guardians, you may be leaving the theater halfway through to some weeping kids, but overall it's still a really good time, and I think it was a really fitting conclusion to at least James Gunn's time with the Guardians of the Galaxy, so I would recommend it.
Yeah.
But
cool.
Yeah, let's dive in. Spoilers from here on out for Volume 3.
Here on out. So we find our heroes at nowhere, and it has been rebuilt, and they have their own little headquarters there now, and they're kind of running the show along with some of Star-Lord's old Ravager buddies.
What I love about this specific section of time, I don't love Star-Lord being like a drunk, depressed mess, but I do love that they got to be a part of this huge cast of characters with the Avengers films, and got to see kind of what they do and how they have this huge compound and this really well put together network, and everything is really super polished within the Avengers universe. And so they tried to do their own version of that, and it is immediately destroyed based on their prior actions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about it that way, but that's a really good point that, between Guardians 2 and this, they've been through some insane shit that, would have shown them how a halfway decent team actually functions. So they would have taken some cues from that. But then also, I think that the events of the Infinity War Endgame stuff would have also, for most of them outside of Gamora, really put it into perspective, how important the Guardians of the Galaxy are in terms of actually being Guardians of the Galaxy and doing their job and protecting people. Because it seems like in this one, they're a lot more put together and serious, at least at the beginning.
It's a lot less about thieving, stealing shit from people and doing their typical space pirate bullshit.
Yeah, and so in the beginning, they're setting up the, like you said, the sign that immediately gets destroyed, but the sign for their little, headquarters and all that stuff, and they're all working together and having a great time, and we open, but the tone is set that this is not going to be your typical happy-go-lucky Guardians of the Galaxy movie by opening with Rocket singing along to an acoustic version of Radiohead's Creep, which I was very excited to hear.
I think it might be my favorite version of that song.
And just the fact that I love the way that James Gunn uses music in his movies. That's been the most iconic part of the Guardians films.
I feel like it was overdone in this one, because there would be parts where it would play a clip of one and then immediately go into the next one. And I was like, well, we didn't really get to enjoy the last one. So it was parts where it was just a little too much. That being said, the song choices were fucking fantastic.
Well, and I just mean in terms of the way that he makes sure that the music stays diegetic, so that whenever a song pops up, it's always coming from the speakers in their helmets, or it's coming from the Walkman or the Zune, or it's coming from the ship. Yeah, and so like so you'll regularly hear the song start out on speakers and then become the score for the movie. And I like that he didn't forget. Not that he would, but like that's been also an iconic part of it, is the upgrading of the music throughout the movies and having it actually be music that the characters are listening to. And I love that now Rocket has had enough time, like with the Zune and the music, that he is singing along to the songs. I thought that was really sweet, like seeing him just walking down and with the headphones and listening to Creep and singing along to it.
When they do that later in the film, they kind of, because this ends up being the majority of it, is a flashback origin to Rocket's creation. From being a regular raccoon to being Rocket Raccoon, and how during his creation they show kind of where his original attachment to music comes from, based on
that scene with the High Evolutionary.
Yeah.
Where he's explaining that, this music is 5,000 years old and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So that brings us to, our two villains for the movie. So first we're introduced to Adam Warlock, played by Will Poulter.
Poultier.
Yeah, and he was teased in the post-credits for the previous film. A lot of people got really hyped, and a lot of people were probably disappointed. I know for sure one person was disappointed that I talked to after the movie, but
I don't know anything about any of the comics or anything, but I know that he was like said to be the big villain of this movie.
Yeah,
and I think even Will Poultier, did press and was like talking about how he like worked out, and I was like, you didn't really need to, like you were in a suit anyway, you could have just put that shit on. But he kind of takes a backseat for a lot of this movie. So for being like a warlock and this big villain, he's really not the villain of this movie.
He doesn't. In the comics, he doesn't really end up being that much of a villain. Like, he's more of like, yes, he does have some times where he's at odds with the Guardians, but he is more of a like borderline anti-hero kind of territory, where he's one of the people in the comic version of the Infinity War that ends up being able to stand toe-to-toe to Thanos and helps with them being able to win at the end.
Oh, okay.
He reminded me a lot of Captain Marvel, where he just has like such an insanely overpowered
power set
that whenever he comes into a scene, I'm just like, okay, how are they going to have to figure out a way to make him disappear for a third of the movie or half of the movie, which they do in this, because he shows up and just immediately completely wrecks shop on nowhere. There we find out that Rocket, after he's attacked, has like a kill switch in his heart that was put there by, we find out, his creator, the High Evolutionary, who is the main villain of the movie, we find out. And so the whole movie revolves around a few different quests that the Guardians have to go on to try to get the code to deactivate the kill switch to rescue Rocket. And so he spends pretty much the entire movie on a med table, and we get the most Rocket through flashbacks, like you said, which I had watched Dan Murrell's review of this before I went in, and so I was kind of prepped for what we were getting into, because he said that he actually felt like Gunn went too far in this movie in terms of the animal stuff. And I think that while it had a lot of impact, it could have been done in a way where it didn't take up so much of the runtime of the movie, because rather than being like, even 2 to 3 longer flashback scenes to Rocket's past, which I'm sure Gunn probably felt would have slowed down the pacing of the entire movie to have chunks that long, we get these very brief, like 9 to 10 flashbacks to Rocket's past. And what it did to me was it made my neck hurt because of the tonal whiplash. I felt like there were actually jokes that would have landed in the movie if they had not been placed immediately after us sobbing at horrific things happening to Rocket.
There were parts where the audience even, because like it would be something that was sad and all of us were basically silent, and I would hear somebody like laugh, and I was like, I think you're getting the wrong idea.
Well, like there was one that I remember vividly where it's just a horrific thing happens to Rocket, and I was crying through most of the movie. And my joking Letterboxd review was, I recommend seeing this in 3D because it's nice to have big glasses on to make it slightly less obvious that you're crying like a small bitch. But I'm pretty sure the whole audience was probably in tears like that during those scenes. Again, if they have a soul. But there's a scene where like something horrific happens, and then we immediately cut to Drax clotheslining somebody off of a dirt bike, and we're all supposed to laugh, and it was dead silent in the theater. Because I just think that it's tough to balance a tone that is going back and forth that rapidly.
I really liked the emotional bits though, and I thought that it worked really well for most of it, and it did let you sit with it for a lot longer than I feel like some of these other movies do, especially in the Marvel universe. Because I mean, you get the Harry Potter Dumbledore train scene toward the end of this one, and I was like, okay, cool, like let's have this moment for him. And I don't know, I like that development of that character a lot in this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I totally agree, and that's why I'm having a hard time kind of working out how it could have been done differently without, like I said, fucking with the pace of the movie, because the thing really goes and it's only, I think, 2 hours long, but
it's 2 hours and like 10 minutes minus the credits.
Yeah, but it moves pretty quick. I didn't feel like it especially dragged in any parts. There's always something happening. It's just that the bouncing back and forth got a little bit kind of discombobulating, especially when we had so many balls in the air, like in the second act and going into the third. But I thought that anytime it started to kind of lose its footing for me, it would pretty quickly bring it back. And I thought the third act like completely knocked it out of the park. And overall, I've always loved the Rocket character, and I loved being able to see his journey in this movie especially, but also just across the three movies. And I do think that these characters have some of the strongest character development in the MCU outside of like Tony Stark or
Steve Rogers,
maybe, like the big tentpole ones we've had, or like, maybe Thor, if his arc up until he became a buffoon. But
does what happened in Love and Thunder kind of change what happened here? Because we don't see Chris Pratt's Star-Lord in the state that he's in when we get to this movie.
So
you know what I mean?
From my understanding, he's still functionally Star-Lord, even during all of this. It's just that when they're not in the act of being the Guardians of the Galaxy, like this process of like setting up camp at nowhere and all of this stuff, he's basically like, because he's not doing anything and he's not putting himself into anything, he is left alone with his thoughts, and that's when things sort of creep. And as somebody who can relate wholeheartedly to that type of emotion, and when they're not like actively doing something, it's really hard to kind of push the demons away. Like, that totally makes sense. And I think that this movie does something that some of the other films in the MCU don't do, which adds to the value and gives more stakes to this without having to kill characters, which I think is really neat. Because like there are a lot of moments where you think that characters aren't going to make it out, and they do, and that's all fine and dandy. We've talked before about how stakes kind of like not being utilized can ruin films. What I feel like this does well is it plays with the prior romances that existed in the first two films and sets you up to where the concept of Peter Quill and Gamora being together is the character that's killed off, because this is a different Gamora and they're two different people at this point.
Yeah. And actually is it's pretty sad to see if you were attached to those characters as they existed in the first two movies, which I think most viewers probably were, and that really is what it feels like. That's a really good way of putting it. Like, it feels like not only did Gamora as a character die in Infinity War, but yeah, like that relationship as a character died, and this whole movie is kind of like, I can't even imagine like how fucked up that would be to lose someone and then have someone who is them but also entirely not them. And I love how the resolution to that is not Star-Lord convincing her that she needs to be that Gamora, but him finally
accepting
that she is not, and accepting that she's found a family somewhere else. And we get that scene of her rejoining the Ravagers at the end, and them all hugging and like so happy to see her. And you realize that, like, you know, like in any healthy relationship, you know, while it may not have worked out, you're happy to see them happy. And at the end, that's kind of him, is he realizes that she's always been searching for a family, and while that may have been the Guardians in this other, you know, reality that they got to live together, you know, and it's also the whole, you know, better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all. And at least they don't leave this movie on as complete enemies like they were at the beginning, where she's just like, who the fuck are you? Like, get
see when she attacked him was fucking intense, and I was like, oh hell yeah, Gunn, push it. Where she was like, I'm not her, and I was like, okay.
I'm curious though, like, how this movie would have been different if these characters hadn't been so radically fucked around with in, and I'm sure that Gunn, you know, he was in the loop for all of this, and because that's how Marvel does these things, is like if they're using those characters, they at least have the people in the loop. But I told you guys I read an interview with Gunn where they asked him, was there anything you didn't like about how the Guardians characters were used or portrayed in the Avengers movies? And he's like, yeah, there are a few things that I wouldn't have done, specifically not having Quill be a dumbass and you know, destroy half the universe. And they address this in this, where he says, like, yeah, I lost my temper and I destroyed half the universe.
He's always been emotional though, so I didn't feel too out of place.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And I think that maybe there's probably a part of Gunn that like projects himself onto the character of Star-Lord, which I think totally makes sense.
Like, I would never do that. Like, I would, yeah. So, and he is and Gunn definitely has been, especially with Rocket. Obviously, he said that like he is Rocket, and he said that that's why this movie was such a big deal for him. Was he felt like Rocket's journey kind of like paralleled his, in terms of the lesson at the end being like, you know, being empathetic to all living creatures and learning to love everything, no matter who they are or what they are, which we've talked about some shitty things that Gunn has done in the past. And so if that's the reality of how his journey has gone as a person, and he wants to showcase that through the Rocket character, I think that's super cool. I mean, that's what art is all about. But yeah, I'm just curious. And like with the Gamora thing, if she hadn't been the character who was killed by Thanos, how would that have played out in this movie? Because unfortunately, because of the way that she has to really be shoehorned sort of back into the Guardians fold, she for most of the movie is like sitting separately from them in the ship, doing her own little side things. And not only does that kind of draw away from the focus of the movie, and again, you know, puts a lot of balls in the air, but it also just feels like kind of unfortunate for her character that she doesn't ever really feel like a part of the team until the very end when they're all working together. And it almost feels like if Gunn had not had to have her in the movie and had been able to completely write her out, he may have had an easier time with telling the story, because I don't really feel like she's entirely necessary, except with Quill being able to get that closure. And because that's the other thing I was thinking about a lot in this, is if this hadn't been Gunn's like last Guardians movie, we may have seen this Gamora and Quill thing extend through maybe another movie or so.
Yeah.
But he kind of had to wrap some of those things up and give all these characters closure. And I agree with you that I'm glad it wasn't through killing a bunch of them, because by the end, the third act of the movie, I was like, I can't handle any of these characters dying, because I'm very attached to all of them. And also we've just been through so much emotional trauma with the Rocket stuff so far that like, just let them get out of this alive at the end.
Yeah. Well, and also them deciding at the end that they were all going to go work on themselves and go their separate ways, I think is also another, like, it's like the death of the Guardians as we know it, and having them all go do different things means that we'll get different stories that allow them to either be inserted into other stuff or allow them to be side characters that can be utilized for other movies, because there's a lot, like, those actors that were chosen, even Chris Pratt included in that conversation, like, really play well off of each other. And I think as those characters, because of how well written they are by Gunn and the writing team that he worked with, like, they do a really good job of like folding in and being able to banter with other characters and things like that. So I think that obviously still full into spoilers territory, at the very end of this, we get a card at the end that says the legendary Star-Lord will return. So obviously Chris Pratt will continue to be in Marvel films. I mean, he's the one who you would have likely expected, but I hope that we get some follow up with some of these other characters and maybe get some other directors who can, take a look at these, these characters in a different way and maybe try to insert them into more stuff. I think a Rocket-led new Guardians group would be super cool to get to follow.
Yeah, it has a very similar feel to, was it the end of, is it Civil War or Age of Ultron? Whichever one ends with Cap going back to the Avengers facility, and he's got like Falcon and Scarlet Witch and all them there, and he's got like his new Avengers team starting. And that seems to be the way they're...
It would have happened in Ultron because I think after Civil War, he's like an enemy of the state, right?
Yeah. He's how did Hannibal Buress say it? He's like a terrorist or something. He says to Spider-Man, he's like, is this guy like a terrorist or something? Yeah. But it does seem like they're trying to say, okay, we're closing out our big franchises and kind of trying to set up, the next generation. But yeah, I would love to see, I think Rocket has endless like team up potential with other characters. It'd be fun to see Groot pop up in other things. I do feel like Groot, there's only so much you can do with Groot, but I don't think that he was really showcased as well as he was in the previous two.
The action of him worked well, but his emotional moments didn't work as well.
Especially with it being a Rocket-centric movie, I was kind of surprised that we didn't get any sort of like emotional father-son moments with Groot and Rocket. It's like Groot kind of like never really acknowledges... And I mean, the other characters can translate what he's saying. He doesn't really ever acknowledge that his dad, like who he considers his dad, is dying. It kind of seemed like a missed opportunity to not gut punch us even more with that relationship. But maybe that's why he didn't do it, is because he felt like we were going through enough with the flashback stuff. But that felt like kind of a missed opportunity. And then it felt like the whole like tacking on Groot finally saying something in English at the end was just his way of like saying, but you got a little bit of a fun Groot thing at the end. I did like seeing like big Goliath, Hulk size. The kaiju was hilarious too.
Yeah.
Well, kaiju.
But yeah, we got some new fun forms. I fucking loved when he had all the guns inside of him. Yeah. Because and then I was like, oh, that's why earlier Quill was like, you know what to do with these.
Yeah.
Hit them all inside.
I think I would have liked even more time with Quill being kind of down in the dumps.
Yeah,
like,
we got over that pretty quick. But it is what John was saying, I think, is that once he's back in action and he has because he's the one that as soon as they're all like, oh God, what do we do? He immediately is like already walking down the hall like, we're going to figure out where this guy is. We're going to get the code. We're going to save Rocket. And I said that it seemed to me like it was Gunn like course correcting Star-Lord's character from being like, because I'd gotten to a point where I couldn't stand him because of how fucking dumb I felt like he had basically turned into a doof. Especially when he's teamed up with Thor, it's always just like it's this macho.
It's almost like a surfer bro fucking like Point Break or some shit.
Like, where it's like Bill and Ted, yeah. And so in this, he actually does, and whether
character instead of a caricature.
Yeah, he steps back into the leader role, and he's the man with the plan throughout pretty much the whole movie, while also carrying all of this emotional burden from potentially losing Rocket. And he even says at the end, he's like, listing the people that he's lost in his life, and he's the one who's like, I'm not fucking giving up on Rocket. And I thought that scene when he's like, when they think Rocket's dead, and he's like
giving him the
CPR and stuff, and he's just like free. I thought that overall everybody was stellar in this, but I thought Chris Pratt, like, it was the best performance that I've seen him give in a really long time. I also thought he looked really good in this movie compared to the previous couple ones. I know they made jokes in the previous ones about him putting on some weight, and I don't know if in this it was to make him look a little bit more down in the dumps, but he did look like he had dropped some weight, and that's not, that's no indication of the quality of his performance, just an observation that I thought that he did look a little bit better in this, but a little bit healthier, I would say. But
yeah, his performance is fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, there's scenes where he's just staring at Gamora, and you can see so much emotion in his facial expressions. I was like, holy shit, man. Like, this is good.
You forget sometimes that he is actually a really good actor because he just kind of is in everything as Chris Pratt.
Yeah.
And you don't really get much out of that. And so, yeah, I thought everybody really stepped up to the plate. Drax had more moments to shine in this than I thought he did, because in the second one, they push him more into the whole
comedic relief,
one-note comedic relief character. In this, he actually gets to be useful and a part of the team, and also gets to kind of address like how the world perceives him as being an idiot. And
I love getting Mantis in like the full movie as well.
Mantis was one of my favorite characters. I mean, I love Mantis, but she was definitely like, she stood out to me in this. I think that Pom Clementief's performance, I think she's just a great fucking actor in general, but she really, to me, had some of the best laughs in the movie too.
Some of the best laughs, but also some of the best like gut punch moments too.
I think that what they do though is sometimes they'll have a joke and they'll just push it until it's dead completely, and they like will repeat it. Like the good dog stuff, like at first it was funny, or the bad dog stuff.
It reminded me of the screaming goats in Love and Thunder.
Yeah,
it's
and I
like,
was like,
hey, you had a
I
joke
get
that
it.
you're just like, do we really need to keep going back to this over and over again?
Right. So there's stuff like that where it's like, okay, that's typical Marvel fare, and then we get this really kind of a boring villain. Like the villain is pretty fucking boring.
I
Both
hated
of
him,
them.
and one of
The only thing I really liked was the like skin, like face prosthetic. Like
and
that
as
was
soon as
cool.
I realized that he must be wearing a mask because Rocket fucked up his face, and I was not expecting it to be as horrific. There's
Oh yeah, that was like nightmare fuel.
There's also a lot of just straight horror stuff
Yeah.
in this, which I was happy to see because that's, you know, James Gunn's roots. But
Right.
the weird fucking mole rat like robot thing that's, you know, it's all like dissected and shit, and the weird like Rick and Morty flesh asshole station they go to, and and they have to like squeeze through like these fleshy holes. It's all very weird and gross, and I like that. It feels very alien. But no, I totally agree that, and that's Gunn in all of his movies, is that like he has stuff that really, really I think is fucking hilarious, and then he has that kind of like, you know, juvenile humor that he wants to drag out until it's not funny anymore.
Yeah, there's that, and then like we said, the villain. It's a pretty predictable movie. Not that is a bad thing, but like it's not pushing any like new ground with what it's doing. So I think it still has a lot of the typical like Marvel staples and stuff that is getting tired, like we've talked about. But it still is better than a lot of what's come out recently.
Yeah,
and I think
by far.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes down to just being emotionally invested in the characters.
Yeah,
that's the thing, is like a lot of this you could compare to Ant-Man Quantumania in terms of the, you know, the way some of the worlds look. I think overall the effects in this looked a million times better than anything in,
a lot of it's practical and sets though.
Yeah, but even like I think that Gunn, I think he gets a lot of I just think there's more put into his Guardians movies because Marvel knows that they're special. Mm-hmm. Like they really feel like their own separate thing that Marvel is like lucky to have been able to roll into the rest of their stuff. And so it just really feels like they go all in terms of making everything look like, I don't feel like the quality of the way these movies look has dropped at all. If anything, it's gotten better as the movies have progressed. It's maybe not as big and bombastic as like, you know, Ego the Living Planet and a big fucking fight to Fleetwood Mac flying through the air and everything. But I, on the one hand, appreciated that the villain in this wasn't like, and they even address it where he's like, oh, I'm not trying to like take over the universe. I'm trying to like evolve it or whatever. But I thought that the performance was weak because all he does is fucking scream throughout the entire movie.
and like has power set that he will sometimes use and sometimes doesn't use.
And also is just King's power set that we saw in Quantumania. Why does every bad guy now just shoot, you know, lasers that have no discernible, like, you don't know what the fuck anybody's powers do, because he just, sometimes he can blast people across the room, sometimes he can, it's like, okay, so he has those powers, but where do those come from? And and then this whole bit about, really, what makes him a villain is that you're just supposed to hate him because he's a piece of shit to animals, which, I mean, it really is enough to make you hate somebody.
Like people now.
Yeah, but it doesn't make him compelling. It makes him a piece of shit that you want to see die, but it doesn't make him compelling. And that was also something that was getting on my nerves in the movie, is that a lot of the humor in this is just people screaming at each other. All of just the scenes are just, what if we bickered a little bit and then both just started screaming at each other? There's a lot of scenes of Mantis and Drax, and the funny part is just that Mantis eventually loses her shit and screams. There's a lot of scenes of Nebula losing her shit and screaming at everybody. There's a lot of scenes.
I don't think that Karen, is it Gillian?
Yeah.
I don't know. There's parts of it I like her performance, but then there's other parts where I'm like, I just don't buy you as this character. And I feel like her voice changes throughout the whole thing, where sometimes it's like really deep, And
well, she's Scottish in
not.
real life, so I could understand
Right.
that she may be. I mean, at this point, I wouldn't think she would have too much trouble with the accent, but I like her character arc. But she's another character that I didn't feel like really had much to do outside of she had the really useful all-purpose robot arm that she could like hack into shit with and shoot people like Cyborg, and that was cool. But yeah, I didn't feel like her character, because I was expecting, they hint a little bit that maybe because she had a similar character arc to Gamora, that maybe her and Star-Lord might have a thing in this movie, and I was like,
Glad they didn't.
Yeah, I'm glad they steered away from that.
yeah, no, I was glad that it didn't happen, but that at least seemed like it was hinting at either maybe a future storyline with those characters that could happen if somebody decides they want to pick it up, or just showing that like she's come so far as a character that they can actually, he's sort of looking at her in that way now, when before he just used to completely despise her. But yeah, overall, I think she's just kind of there to just scream and be angry,
which they address, and then they get into it, and she changes, and we don't get a ton of romance between Mantis and Drax, but that still, I feel like, has kind of been hinted at, and that's all like boiling under the surface. What I did like what they do with Drax, and I don't think we touched on it yet, is talking about him being a father, and that's something that is very in the forefront of the first Guardians. I mean, his whole plot for revenge against Ronan is because he killed his wife and daughter. And I think that we forget that about his character throughout the rest of his time in the MCU.
Well, and that's why he tries to just like fucking rush Thanos in Infinity War, is because he's like, you know, he's responsible for my family dying, and so he tries to like rush him and gets them in trouble. So like, we get it hinted, but yeah, I like that it comes full circle for him too, and it's like, yeah, you're a father.
I thought it was great.
I also like that they not so subtly hint at kind of the, like, as him being like a comedic character. They have that really beautiful moment in Guardians Volume 2 where him and Mantis are sitting staring out at like the sunset on Ego's planet, and she touches him to feel what he's feeling and is so overcome with her emotions that she's like broken down into tears, and he's just calm. And they go to a certain length at this where he can no longer keep up that facade because of all of the things that are happening and how invested he is with the Guardians as a family, where he's pushed to tears during the film. And I think it's like I said, it goes to show a lot about the growth and arc of that character, even though it's a character that's often played for jokes.
Yeah, I really felt like I was convinced that these people actually meant a lot to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of moments in this where they like, I think Nebula at one point has a line too where she's talking about Rocket, and I think it's maybe Gamora or somebody says like, "Oh, well, like I'm family" or something. She's like, "He is too." And yeah, it just connected with me emotionally, and that's really all I need from these movies that I don't really get from them anymore. And for a lot of them, is just like there's just no emotional investment in anything for me. And
it's hard.
And this I was like, I can totally have fun with all of the crazy CG.
There were times with the CG, and I don't know if you guys noticed this, but it got like too close to stuff. Where like they were flying in the spaceship, and it would be like really close to it, so you couldn't really see what was going on, and then it would come out. And there was other stuff where it would just get really close. And I was like, don't do that.
I do want to see this
too close.
Not in 3D, because
some of the depth stuff was so fucking cool though. Like even the title, just the title having that depth, I was like, that's really cool.
Yeah, no, I'm not mad that I saw it in 3D, because like I said last night when we got out of it, space shit I think is the best showcase for 3D. Gravity I thought was amazing in 3D. For the depth, like for me it's just like if you can make a space feel like you're actually in it, which if it's a spaceship, that's a dope feeling to feel like you're actually standing in the cockpit of the spaceship of the Bowie with the Guardians, and getting all that depth is really cool. But two things is, I want to see how the effects play, because I did notice that there was some of it where it felt like it was a little bit too close. I want to see how that plays not in 3D, and also the color. So anytime you're watching something in 3D, there's going to be that minor downgrade in color because of just like the way the 3D works. And while it wasn't crazy noticeable after a certain point, I do want to see this not in 3D, just because I'm sure that the colors really, really pop.
Yeah.
But I mean, seeing this in IMAX and with the sound, especially with the music, I mean, it was pretty fucking awesome. And overall, we had a good crowd outside of the usual, like, just, 100 people showing up. They've had, a fucking hour lead up to get into the movie. 20 minutes, well, not 20 minutes of trailers for IMAX, but, and just shuffling in at the end. But anyway. Anywho, I had this hunch about the High Evolutionary because I don't know if you guys recall this, but back in the 90s, there was a like sort of sequel show to the Spider-Man animated series called Spider-Man Unlimited.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, Spider-Man like gets on a rocket with Venom and Carnage and goes to Counter Earth, and the entire series takes place on Counter Earth, and he's with like animal people. And I was watching this, and I was like, "Is this the same like thing from Spider-Man Unlimited?" And so I looked into it. Yeah, it's the main villain of the series is the High Evolutionary, and he goes to Counter Earth, and it's all populated by his like society of animal people. And people fucking hated it back then because they were like, "What the fuck is this? Like Spider-Man on a world of Zootopia people?"
Yeah.
But that was really fascinating for me to make that connection where I was like, "Oh, cool." Like that probably means nothing to anybody else in this theater, but it means a lot to me, even though I didn't think the villain was very interesting or compelling. But
yeah, I like that we got to see his fucked up face. Pretty gruesome. The scene that we hadn't really talked about is when they get into the ship and they're all working together fighting, and it's I don't know if it's one take, but it's a few long takes put together, and it's just floating around the room and they're all doing their Guardians thing. I think it's the first time they're all fighting together again, and it's pretty fucking tight.
Yeah, it reminded me a lot of the church scene from Kingsman, along with other scenes that
Aquaman, where the camera is just flying up to the ceiling and all over the place. But yeah, if this is the way that Gunn wants to do action going forward, like into his DC stuff, into Superman, I'm here for it because he finds a way to one just having the camera doing things that are not possible without computer effects and things like that, but to where it still feels like a real camera, and the way that it's flying through the action, it like takes time to basically give each character the little like action moment splash page, but it's not like it's doing the constant like slow down speed. I don't know. It's hard to explain without seeing it. Like just the way that it's done, I think is super cool, and it also just shows how far Gunn has come as a director. Like I think this is his, probably most technically impressive directed movie, even if the structure of it I don't think really worked as well as something like the first Guardians. I think that like directing wise, this is his best in terms of getting the best performances out of his actors, and doing the cool stuff with the action, because that hallway scene was just fucking amazing. And then I know we've just said that we cried or got very emotional during the rocket stuff.
The ending when Peter goes home.
Yeah.
I was like, oh shit, I'm about to set off again.
Well, and that's something that I think I had heard people saying, why didn't Quill ever go back to Earth? Because he's still got family there, and it was something that everybody kind of just assumed that would never get addressed. So I liked that got brought up here, and that the whole theme of most of these characters that they've all been running from, some traumatic thing in their past, whether it's Thanos being their dad or Rocket's trauma from his upbringing. He's been trying to avoid it and not talk about it and run away from it, and he finally has to confront it at the end, and it gets him to save all the other animals and and go back into all that. And so everybody gets kind of a nice closing chapter to their story. And I liked the little post credits with him eating the cereal and just gossiping with his grandpa.
They in that scene, and then during the credits they show a picture of Kevin Bacon like in the credits, and then in that scene when he's reading the paper, it's like Kevin Bacon,
it's like alien abduction,
which is a reference to the Christmas special, but that doesn't get addressed in this movie. So if you hadn't seen that, you're like, what the fuck?
Yeah, the only other time that they really mention is they do one or two Mantis's Quill's sister mentions, which is something you wouldn't know. A lot of people saying like you have to have watched the Christmas special.
Not really.
There's so much random shit going on in this that you don't necessarily have to have seen it, but people who are like really invested would probably be confused about the whole sister thing. But it's not like that ever really comes into play about them being siblings. But
and they're like loose siblings, right?
Half siblings, yeah.
Because
Ego.
They're both,
they're.
But
in God's eyes, they're siblings, yeah. But yeah, I thought that the rocket stuff was pretty brutal. I think the worst of it is like in the first like 15-20 minutes of the movie when he's like the smallest, and he has like the procedure done on his brain, and he like first goes back into the cage and he's just like shaking and like whimpering, and the otter and all of them are like trying to talk to him, and he just says like hurts. I fucking lost it. I was like, I can't do this. It made me really nervous because I was like, I don't know if I can handle this. And while it continues to be fucked up, you know, from that, it's not like every scene that it would cut back to the animals, I was expecting somebody to come in and just start blowing their heads off, which eventually is what happens. But I also thought that, I don't know if it was Bradley Cooper doing the voice throughout the entire thing and they were just pitch changing it. I know by the end, I think, when Rocket tries to escape and then the High Evolutionary just kills all of his friends, when he's just screaming, like standing there screaming, and then finally, picks up the gun and starts going, I thought, just great performance for Bradley Cooper at playing a raccoon.
We talked about it with something else recently, but it's like you feel so much pain and emotion from these things that just aren't real things. Like none of that exists.
I was having a lot of Planet of the Apes.
Is that what we were talking about? Maybe. Yeah.
Vibes.
That's exactly what it is. Yeah, because we felt so strongly for Caesar and his crew, and it's like that's not even a real person or animal. Like that's nothing. That's just a computer image. And same with this. Like we felt so much emotion. And I think that goes down to performance and it goes down to the writing.
Yeah.
To bring it back to,
and also just the crazy amount of work by the VFX artists, who obviously, it is well known, do not get the credit they deserve from Marvel and from the company that they, from the company and from people. But I think the movie looks fantastic, and the way they were able to bring to life these animal characters and make them emotional and convincing, it was heartbreaking. Yeah, and really, I think that it's going to affect a lot of people pretty deeply. But
what are your overall thoughts? Like, is there anything that you didn't like? Was there anything that wasn't working for you, or was it all 100% John?
No, I think that in some ways this is the strongest film of the trilogy. In some ways this is the weakest. I feel very similarly to a film series that James Gunn has said he's taken a lot of inspiration from to create this, and that's Star Wars. I feel like Return of the Jedi is the same way. It's the strongest in some ways and the weakest in others. I feel like this takes the emotions that are really present in Volume 2 and turns all that shit up to 11. And I think focusing on Rocket is a masterstroke. I think that character needed more time, and I think that we got all the time we needed. And I think that that's great. There are little subtle things that I feel like could have been done better. I think that they could have made Warlock less of a doof. I think that would have been beneficial. I know they played him for jokes most of the time, and he gets to have his moment at the end. But they could have polished that character a little more and given us more of an arc to get us to that place.
Or just not included him.
Yeah. I know that they kind of backed themselves into a corner by making it at the end of Volume 2 that they were going to involve him, and then had a billion more movies in between then. But I also know that James Gunn's plan was not to get fired and then rehired, so that also plays a factor into all of it.
Let's briefly touch on how fucking insane that entire thing is. So he is now the head of DC Studios because he got fired by Disney.
Yeah, he leaked the tweets.
You would, one might think, but and if like he said, his journey. Because those old tweets reflect potentially those old days that he's not proud of, and if he feels this strongly about this redemption arc, paralleling Rockets and everything, for this to be his final movie with Marvel before he goes off to do this next huge thing that is a direct result of what happened. It's just insane that he was able to leave that he got fired from there, did a pretty darn good Suicide Squad movie.
Definitely better.
Yeah.
If nothing else.
Yeah, knocked that out of the park, and then was able to hop back, complete this, wrap up his whole trilogy, and then is now going to go do a fucking Superman movie, which, like I said, I think the Adam Warlock stuff in here, he probably didn't cut it because he wanted to use it for his reel to show, I can do Superman. Look at this.
And I think it's unnecessary. The character is basically unnecessary. And, at one point, this High Priest, High Evolutionary destroys his mom, is responsible for killing his mom, and as a result of that he goes and attacks the Guardians. And so I was like, if you're mad and seeking revenge, why wouldn't you go to the person that blew up the planet? And so I was like, that's a little weird.
Yeah.
Like, that could have been a good time and made more sense for him to switch than, like, him getting his life saved.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, well, this guy killed my mom, so at least let me fight. Like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation.
Yeah. Take all the villain stuff out of this movie. The rest of it, I think, is pretty great.
I loved the Guardian costume this time around. The adding of the blue to like the typical Ravager's red, I think worked really well. But in the same conversation, when it comes to costumes, the fact that there wasn't a new Star-Lord mask is pretty upsetting.
I wanted to ask you about that.
Why?
What the fuck happened to his Star-Lord gear? Was there something in the Christmas special or something that explained why he just doesn't use that anymore?
Because all he has that he utilized before are his pistols. That's it. Because he doesn't have his mask and he doesn't have his boots.
There were a million times in this movie where I was like, why aren't you flying around with your jet boots?
That's like the whole part of your character that makes you different than just a dude with guns.
Yeah, it's also just like an iconic Star-Lord thing. And
they took it out because then the whole ending wouldn't have been able to happen. He could have flown all the way through and wouldn't have had to get bloated. Like,
didn't we also do that exact thing in the last movie or the first movie?
In the first one, well, Gamora goes out.
Yeah, I know it was reversed, but the same idea. Mm-hmm. And then we saved that person, and
puts the mask on her. So that's got to be exactly why, so that we can have that ending.
Yeah, and that halfway through, I noticed that and went, it's probably a plot thing, which is not good enough for me.
Yeah,
because I want to see him zooming around and being Star-Lord. It's not really that big a deal, but I was curious about it. There was that, and then also, so when Ego was destroyed, I assume that means that Quill then lost any superpower godlike abilities that he had.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I figured. I just didn't remember totally.
I think they mention it explicitly in that moment. Like he's like if you destroy me, then you're just a regular guy or whatever.
I figured. And then
so he couldn't handle an Infinity Stone now.
No.
Yeah, and then the most I thought, I was like, yeah, there's probably an explanation for why he doesn't use the Star-Lord stuff. Like, either he feels like it's maybe a holdover from his thieving days, and he, ditched all that stuff for this, new Guardian's life. But I'm like, yeah, that's just as useful, bro. Mm-hmm. Just get new jet boots and a new mask. Anyway, I had a great time with it. This could potentially, and I'll see The Flash. I was going to say this could potentially be the last superhero movie that I actively go out to see for a while, because I can't really think of anything that is even remotely piquing my interest superhero wise. But I'm sure we'll go see The Flash, just to see if it's a complete train wreck or if it's, because I want to get nuts. So let's get nuts.
Sounds good to me. All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for our episode this week. We hope that you enjoyed that. If you haven't already, head over to patreon.com/porcelainpeak, and you can get our bonus episode where we just talked about Jennifer's body. And next week, we're talking about Knock at the Cabin.
Knock, knock, knock.
So those have been
you know what
fun.
You know what you're supposed to do when somebody knocks at the cabin? Open the fucking door.
Probably my favorite line in the movie.
I said the only F-bomb in the MCU.
Yeah, until
really?
Deadpool sweeps in and
yeah.
pow, pow, pow. But yeah, I couldn't
check
stop
those
laughing.
out. Yeah, and then next week we're gonna continue animation and we're talking about Princess Mononoke. So stay tuned and watch that movie if you hadn't. And we'll see you then. I've been Tone.
I've been John.
And I've been the guardian of the internet darlings, Galaxy, Star-Lord, Anthony, man.
Thank you for watching and or listening.
Keep it creepy.